difficult week,
Difficult.
unfortunately.
Why? What's
Um,
what's wrong?
I lost a very, very good friend and former classmate on that year, 96.
Oh,
Just passed suddenly on last Monday. And
oh, accept our condolences,
it's
man.
been like a bolt out of the blue.
Yeah, I can
Very
imagine.
young person, very hardworking, very affable character, a peacemaker, and it's taken us all by surprise. So it's been a difficult um, few days.
Really sorry to hear about that.
Yeah, thank you,
Please
Lexis.
accept our
Uh,
condolences.
thank
But
you, thank you.
so I'm really grateful that you still have been able to make time to spend time with us here on
Mm,
Joy
mm,
FM.
mm.
Because one of our listeners sent in a very interesting issue that we thought that we all need some education on.
Let's say,
Lexus, I urgently need for the drive doctor to help me out with some education. I was recently informed that my 46-year-old cousin has been ill and diagnosed with a blood and bone marrow disorder. He complains of fatigue on minimal exertion, bleeding from the gums and nostrils with minimal provocation, loss of appetite, skin
mm,
rashes, and
mm.
significant weight loss in the past 3 months. He's been undergoing a battery of tests, but appears to be deteriorating. What exactly could be wrong with him? Is he suffering from blood cancer? What can we do to help him? Doc.
Right. So once again, good afternoon to all our listeners. And Kwame, before we get into it, today I met one of your most loyal or our loyal listener um, at the clinic. Her
Oh.
name is Madame Linda Nikwe.
Oh.
She says I should pass on this message to you.
Uh huh.
Lexis, you crack too many jokes and waste Dr. Safo's time. You people are always laughing. Then you leave only 3 minutes for us to ask questions. So please, you people should stop the laughing. So, Kwame, because we can't really you are laughing. The thing that you are complaining about.
Oh,
So, Kwame, let's
what's your
laugh
name
for the
again?
last time. So, rather, when we come, it's all serious.
We have to
Oh,
be
no.
serious, serious.
Right.
Oh my
So
goodness.
we're going to talk about blood and bone marrow disorders. I think
Mm,
that's what the listener sent in.
right.
That his cousin has been diagnosed, if I had right, with blood and bone marrow disorder.
I remember bone marrow. It doesn't have anything to do with leukemia because I remember back in the day, there was a very
Right,
popular
right,
gentleman.
right. I mean, remember your notes. You remember your notes. That's very good.
Yeah,
That's very good.
you know
You
there was a
know,
very popular gentleman. I've forgotten his name. Something White,
um,
who was doing
um,
some
Danny
campaign.
White.
Danny White, yes, he was doing some campaign
Yes.
about leukemia.
Yes, absolutely. Like you're absolutely right. I think it came down to Ghana. He
Yeah.
was Ghanaian, born I think in the UK. I think either father was Ghanaian and the mother was Caucasian.
Okay.
So, and I think he drew a lot of attention to leukemia.
Yes, he did. He really
Oh,
did some good campaign on it, and I think that's
exactly
the first time I got to know a little bit about these.
about it. Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to make a firm diagnosis, but everything is pointing to this possibly being a leukemia, because of all the symptoms that we talked about.
Hmm.
Gums, bleeding from the gums, minimal fatigue on minimal exertion, bleeding from the nostrils, all on minimal provocation, loss of appetite, skin rashes, and weight loss in the past 3 months. So it is possible, but we'll need further and better particulars. But I'm going to use today and probably next week as an opportunity to discuss leukemias, because that is one of the possibilities here. So, what is leukemia, or when we talk about the leukemias, what do we mean? The leukemias are a group of disorders characterized by the accumulation of abnormal white blood cells in the bone marrow and the blood. So, Kwame, we have abnormal white cells. Remember 2 weeks ago when I was talking about blood transfusion and blood types, I did mention that the blood has a cellular part and then it has a liquid part.
Yes.
And the cellular part has three main cells. You've got red cells, white cells, and then platelets. The white cells are primarily responsible for defense against infections, a wide spectrum of infections and microorganisms. So when we talk about the leukemias, we're not talking about just one entity. It's a group of disorders characterized by the accumulation of abnormal white cells, both in the bone marrow, where it starts from, and then it spills over into the peripheral blood. These abnormal white cells cause symptoms because they negatively affect the normal function of the bone marrow. And Kwame, you see, the bone marrow is that thing that, you know, in our part of the world, when you are even served with a lot of meat, you still have to break the bones of the chicken when you are eating.
Yeah.
We will crack the bones and then suck out that very tasty, semi-solid tissue in the bone. And that is the bone marrow. The function of the bone marrow is to produce red cells, to produce white cells, and then also platelets. The platelets are the cells that are responsible or assist us in clotting whenever we have a bruise, a cut, or a disturbance in the integrity of the blood vessel wall. The white cells, as I mentioned earlier, helps our body defend against infections from a wide spectrum of microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, worms, and so on and so forth. And then the red blood cells obviously help carry oxygen around the body to supply the various cells in the body. So that is the function of the bone marrow in making all of these cells for us. So when you have abnormal white cells in large quantities, then they negatively affect the normal function of the bone marrow, such that your doctor may say you have developed what we call bone marrow failure. Again, the symptoms can be related to the infiltration of many organs by these abnormal white cells. And the usual organs that these abnormal white cells would infiltrate are the skin, the spleen, which is located the left upper part of the abdomen, the liver, and the brain. These are common places that it goes to. So the individual may present with symptoms referable to these organs. Leukemias are broadly classified into two categories. We have the acute and then the chronic. So when you may hear somebody saying that I have been diagnosed with an acute leukemia or a chronic leukemia. These are further subdivided into two categories. You've got I call them the L and the M. So, or the lymphoid and the myeloid. So the L and then the M. So broadly, you have acute and chronic leukemias. I think most of us would know that. Today, I want us to focus on the acute leukemias. These are usually very, very aggressive in terms of their progression, the natural history of the disease. Without any intervention, what happens? That is what we mean by the natural history. So they're usually very aggressive diseases. There's usually an accumulation of immature white cells in the bone marrow and other organs, leading to bone marrow failure. So when we talk about the abnormal white cells, they are actually immature white cells. So within the bone marrow, just as when a baby is born, very, very fragile, all it does is cry, can't talk, can't walk, and then the baby grows. The same thing happens with our white cells. Within the bone marrow, they are initially produced as very, very immature white cells, which then develop and differentiate into the different types of white cells that perform different functions for us. But in the acute leukemia, something goes wrong within with the genes that help in the maturation of these white cells, and therefore the individual is not able to mature their white cells, and you have an accumulation of immature white cells in the bone marrow, and then they just fill it up, blocking the production of, say, red cells, blocking the production of, say, the platelets, which are important for prevention of bleeding, and this is what we will term as bone marrow failure. Don't forget that these white cells themselves have a function. Their function is to protect you against infection, but they've got to be mature before they are able to do that.
Okay.
And therefore, when you have the accumulation of the immature white cells, then you are almost defenseless. Kwame, I hope you get it.
I get it.
Yes. So this individual becomes totally defenseless against microorganisms, and they are battered with infections left, right, center. Again, you don't have enough red blood cells, so your doctor will tell you that you are anemic. And when you are anemic, it means you cannot transport oxygen around your body. Your cells, therefore, go into failure. Then again, they bleed a lot, spontaneous bleeding. So the person who sent in, our listener who sent in this message, talked about the cousin suffering bleeding from the gums, bleeding from the nostrils with minimal provocation. Minimal provocation. And that points to most likely a problem with the platelets. Either they have not been produced at all or bone marrow failure across board. He also did mention that he has fatigue on minimal exertion. I mean, if you're not sending oxygen around your body very well, then this is exactly what happens. What happens is that you feel very tired, you're lethargic, very little things, and then you're totally out of breath, so on and so forth. So that is why I think that this is possibly a leukemia. The acute leukemias, although fairly rapidly fatal if not treated, and that's what I mean by it being aggressive, they are easier to treat. Paradoxically, they are easier to treat compared to their chronic counterparts. As I did mention, there are two main types of the acute leukemias. You have what we call ALL and then AML. The L and the M types of acute leukemias. If you can't remember the full meaning, you can just remember the L type and then the M type. So ALL and then AML. What are the causes or risk factors? Well, we're not exactly sure about the possible causes, but we think there's a combination of genetic and environmental factors. So when it comes to the leukemias, we talk about risk factors for the leukemia. So for the acute leukemias, there are some risk factors. We think there's a genetic predisposition, meaning if you have a family history of somebody with leukemia, then you will be at a higher risk compared to others without a family history. And Kwame, again, I would reiterate the point. We need to all get to know a lot about family history. More often than not, I would ask people in the clinic, is anybody in your family suffering from hypertension or diabetes? Then they'll go like, oh, no, nobody in my family suffers from that. I'm like, okay, do you know your second cousin? Any of your second cousins? There's no. Do you know an uncle? No. And they don't know anybody in the extended family, yet they would immediately jump to the conclusion that nobody suffers from high blood pressure or diabetes. So let us all make the effort to really know about the family medical history. There are a couple of viruses, including the HIV virus or HIV, which can also lead to the development of leukemia. There's also another virus called HTLV virus, HTLV. This can also cause that. We also believe that exposure to petrochemicals, such as benzene. So this is where I have a lot of concern for particularly the mechanics and others who are continuously exposed to petrochemicals. Those who work in the filling stations. We don't take the necessary precautions because most places probably will not have an occupational health program to look at some of these things. But exposure to petrochemicals has been mentioned as a risk factor for the development of leukemias. Okay. Again, extensive exposure to artificial, what we call ionizing radiation, can also lead to that, especially those who work in the X-ray units, for example. And that is why in the X-ray units, the Ghana Atomic Energy Commission will, for example, make sure that the walls of the X-ray unit are of a certain thickness, and those who work in there have what we call a Geiger counter, which measures the exposure to radiation, and also they wear what we call the lead aprons to also reduce the amount of radiation that they are exposed to. Sometimes, unfortunately, the chemotherapy agents that we use to treat other types of cancers like breast or ovarian unfortunately would also increase your risk of developing a leukemia.
Wow. Very interesting education there, if I can put it that way.
Mm.
For me, what's key is it means that there's not a lot we can do to prevent it, apart from those who are exposed to the petrochemicals, like you're saying, is it?
Right. So since we don't know, we don't have a direct cause, but these are risk factors. So Kwame, if you know your family history, for example, then you would make sure that you make frequent trips to your doctor. You discuss that with your doctor, and then we would make sure we put in place a screening program to pick it up if anything is going to happen. And Kwame, it's a very simple test. Sometimes a full blood count, which is a test that people trivialize, like the way we trivialize paracetamol. And say, oh, when I went to the hospital, they didn't do any tests at all for me. They just asked me to do a full blood count. But it is one of the most insightful tests that can ever be requested by your doctor. It can point to the early development of a leukemia. And then we should also protect ourselves because HIV is a sexually transmitted disease. So we make sure that we practice safe sexual habits. And then we also do the petrochemicals, make sure that we are not exposing our skin to it. And then also those who work in places where radiation exposure, make sure you take the necessary precautions. So, Kwame, there's quite a lot that we can still do, although we do not have a direct cause for it.
Okay. So earlier you talked about how the acute leukemia can be treated, right?
Yes. So before I talk about the treatment, Kwame, let me again emphasize how it presents in a patient. So this acute leukemias, most of the time, the L type is very common in children, although it can occur in adults as well, with frequency increasing in the 40-plus year group. But the M type occurs in all ages. L type is very, very common in children, can also be found in adults, but the M type age group, 36 years, maybe.
Hello, Doc.
Yeah.
You're breaking up on me. If you can actually position yourself well, I'll be glad.
Is it better?
Yeah, it's better.
Can you hear me now? Okay, so I was just saying that most of the time, individual will present with fatigue, they tire easily, they experience shortness of breath, there is a loss of appetite, and then they have symptoms of infection, have a fever, and they have multiple infections of the throat, skin, lungs. So if you're anyone who's having recurrent infections of the throat, skin, ears, and you have a fever all the time, it's a good thing to talk to your doctor and maybe specifically ask him to probably screen you for a possible bone marrow failure. But most doctors will do it if this becomes a recurrent thing. Also, spontaneous bruising. I mean, I've seen people who, when you just grab them by their forearm forcefully, then you find it bleeding into their skin, and you have these dark patches, especially if they are light skin, dark patches in the skin. We call them purpuric patches. There's also sometimes tender bones. Their bones are very, very, they complain about pain in their bones. And then they've got these very, very little swellings, painless swellings in their necks, in their armpits, and then in their groin regions. If you find these painless lumps in these areas, it may be evidence of organ infiltration by abnormal cells. We call them lymphadenopathy. And then also a mass in the upper left side of your abdomen. If there is a mass in the upper left side of your abdomen, it may be a spleen enlargement, and you can get your doctor to check it out. Unfortunately, the brain can also take a hit. And if the brain takes a hit, most people will have these persistent headaches that don't seem to resolve with taking painkillers. Nausea and vomiting also becomes a constant feature. There's also sometimes blurring of vision, and then also the development of what we call double vision. You stick up one finger, and then they tell you that you have two fingers up. So these are some of the symptoms of, or that are suggestive of acute leukemia, and therefore warrant a trip to see your doctor. A number of investigations, which are usually very simple ones, will be requested by a doctor: a full blood count, kidney function test, liver function test, would ask for some x-rays, and then based on the results of these things, your doctor may ask for a much more invasive test like a bone marrow aspirate to be done, where we go deep into the bone and with a needle and draw some of the bone marrow for analysis. There is treatment, especially with the acute leukemias. They tend to respond very well. The treatment is usually specific depending on the diagnosis, so I won't go much into that, but we would broadly call it chemotherapy. And then we'll also give you supportive treatment, treat the fever with antibiotics, and sometimes even give you transfusion with whole blood or blood products.
I think in the case of Danny White that I remember, they were asking for a match, a bone marrow match or something of the sort.
Absolutely. So because the problem is with the bone marrow, because he had developed bone marrow failure, what we're going to do, and that's where the bone marrow holds what we call the stem cells. These are the, if you like, the original cells that we all develop from. So your hair cells go all the way back to stem cells, which will then develop into red cells, platelets, and then white cells. So what is going to happen is that we get a match from a suitable donor. We harvest their bone marrow, and then we transplant the bone marrow into the patient who has developed bone marrow failure, and voila, that is it. But it is not that simple. This is a tissue transplant. It's a tissue transplant. So you must find a suitable candidate. I remember Danny White lived in the UK, and because genetically he's African, and in their tissue and organ banks out there, it's mainly, the population is largely Caucasian. It was very difficult for him to find a match. If he was going to find a match, he would most likely get it from a largely African population. And part of the reason why he came down as well. Okay. So it's one of the things that we need to push to develop to do in this country. We don't have organ banks. We don't have tissue banks well developed to sometimes do all of these things. And people still have to go outside to go and get these things done. We have the human resource to do it in Kolibu, in particular. The human resource exists. The logistics can readily be made available. It's just that whole organization to get a tissue on organ bank well established in this country is where we need to be going to be able to provide definitive cure for individuals who have these conditions.
Awesome. This is some good education. Thank you so much, Doc. I'm grateful that you made time to share with us. I'm sure a lot of our listeners will want to contact you and get some more clarity or probably seek your services as well. So how do they reach you?
Right. So Kwame, next week we'll be doing a part 2 where I'll be looking at a lot more of the chronic leukemias. So the phone number is 0501 477 340. 0501 477 340.
Doc, thank you so much. And
you're welcome.
Have a great evening as well. Dr. Yawasafo is CEO of Medicas Hospital. Probably you need to go get a full blood count and speak to your doctor about leukemia.
Modern vampires of the season.